Welcome to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 253. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas, where it is 79 degrees on Friday, March 13th, 2026, otherwise known as FRyeDay. F-R-Y-E-D-A-Y. This will be an intro to whiskey episode number 5, as today we are asking the question, what is rye whiskey? Now, we have previously addressed the question of what is FRyeDay, but now we're going to dig deeper into the whole rye whiskey phenomenon. These studies I am calling Intro to Whiskey are a combination of my research and personal experience with the topic of whiskey. Very early in my whiskey journey, I came across the term rye whiskey and heard or read that it was more spicy than bourbon, not as sweet. Up to this time, I had only been drinking things like Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, and Elijah Craig, I think. So I walked into the Specs liquor store in Fort Worth and asked one of the guys who worked there about rye whiskey. And I stated that I liked spicy foods, and I'd heard that rye was more spicy. And he agreed, took me to the rye section where he recommended a couple of ryes. I can't remember exactly which one I walked out with, but it was either Wild Turkey 101 or James E. Pepper 1776. Those two were my first rye whiskeys, and I was an immediate fan. So, the question, what is rye whiskey? What distinguishes it from bourbon or other whiskeys? Why did I like it so much? Are all ryes the same, or are there different types of ryes? Now, right now, while I do this video, I will be sipping on an international rye. This is Powers Irish rye whiskey. So this is an Irish whiskey and it's 100% rye. But I'll be spending my time talking about American rye whiskeys because there's different rules for different nations. So I'll be talking about the American style of rye whiskeys. So first, science, law, and tradition. There's technical and scientific elements to whiskey. There's legal elements. There's the history and tradition element. It all combines together to make whiskeys special. So let's look at the science aspect of it. Rye grain is Cicale cereale or Cicale cereale, something like that. It's Latin. It's been a long time since I studied Latin. But it is a cereal grass grain related to wheat and barley. It's all in the same family. And we think rye grain may have originated in Turkey in Neolithic times, but was not actually cultivated intentionally until the Roman period. And then it became more widespread in the Middle Ages. The Romans did bring rye to England, and some has been found there in Roman caches. It is cultivatable in colder, drier climates with poorer soil, such as Northern Europe, Northern Asia, Northern North America. So the early English and Scottish settlers brought it with them when they settled in North America, specifically New England. It grew better there in New England than wheat or barley did. Rye is used for bread, beer, whiskey, feed for animals. Rye compared to wheat. Rye offers more fiber, more vitamins, lower glycemic value, while wheat provides a little bit more protein and calories. So that's why if you can have both, wheat tends to be preferred because it's got more calories, more protein. The rye grain has a lot different flavor though. It's got a bolder flavor than wheat. And the rye grain has no external husk like wheat, so it more easily absorbs water and it makes a gummy, sticky mess for those brewers who are making a rye beer or distillers who use it for beer and then whiskey. Rye whiskey then, in America, the rules, the Congress passed laws about this, and so to be called a rye whiskey, the whiskey must have a mash bill of at least 51% rye. It is distilled to no more than 160 proof, but put into the barrel at no more than 125 proof and bottled at no less than 80 proof. It is aged in new charred oak barrels, much like bourbon, and also for an unspecified time. But straight rye whiskey must remain unblended and aged at least 2 years. Prior to the American Revolution, rum was the drink of choice in America, but from the 1760s on, rye whiskey began gaining and soon took over. Because rye grain was so popular in early America, rye whiskey was the most popular whiskey up until the Civil War, when Canadian whiskeys entered the States and gained a strong foothold. And then all the way to Prohibition, rye was more popular. But after Prohibition, bourbons gained the top spot. In fact, in the 1800s, early 1800s, Pennsylvania rye was being produced at 3 times the level as Kentucky bourbon. And then rye fell out of favor in the 1920s and 30s and dwindled to an extreme minority spirit behind bourbon, gin, and vodka. And there's been a rise in popularity of rye, though, in the last 25 years. Old Overholt Rye is the oldest continuous whiskey brand in the country. I've got a bottle of A.Overholt here, which is related. And I'll tell you the story behind this one in a little bit. But Overholt has been a label, has been in constant production since about 1810. And it's the oldest continuous production whiskey that we have. Henry Oberholzer was a German Mennonite farmer who settled in western Pennsylvania in the early 1800s and brought his family tradition of making rye whiskey with him, and a still. But rye had already been popular in America even before that period, even before the Revolutionary War. In fact, the first record of rye whiskey production is from the year 1640 in New Amsterdam by William Cleft, the director of the Dutch colony, and that's New York. George Washington had a distillery with 5 stills in his distillery at Mount Vernon Farm, and he made rye whiskey as well as brandy. His whiskey recipe was 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was kind of the center of rye whiskey production in the early 1700s to early 1800s. And it was those western Pennsylvania farmers making rye whiskey in their small stills on their farms that led to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1790 to 94. All the original cocktails, the whiskey sour, the Manhattan, the old fashioned, were made from rye first. In this book, one of my prime sources for studying rye whiskey, the author's name is Carlo DeVito, and he quotes Dave Pickerel saying, "Rye whiskey was being made and made well for more than a century before bourbon was created." Pickerel goes on, "We do have aspirations of being America's grown-up go-to whiskey." What I mean by that is when people who are drinking bourbon start looking for something with more character, we want to be there for them as an alternative to Scotch. And the author DeVito goes on and states, "We are at the zenith of American rye whiskeys, the golden age of rye." And I would say that, when you study this historically, what you find is that what's on your liquor store shelves now is the widest spectrum of rye whiskeys ever. All right, so let's talk about this spectrum of rye whiskeys. What types of rye whiskeys are there? There are at least 3 different styles of American rye whiskey, and actually probably more, but there's 3 broadly recognized categories. So first is the Monongahela or Pennsylvania style rye. And that is represented by A.Overholt. Now, the regular Overholt rye whiskey that you see on your shelves is not the same mash bill as this. This has a Pennsylvania mash bill. Pennsylvania or Monongahela mash bill is 80 to 100% rye, and the rest is split up between corn and malted barley. So this is a very high rye whiskey that comes from the northern states like Pennsylvania and New York, and it's related to their soils and their climate being more conducive to growing rye than corn. So that's why there's that type of rye. It's all climate and soil related. Well, the second type of rye is known as a Maryland rye. And this has a mash bill of between 65 and 80% rye, with the rest being corn and malted barley. Now, Maryland is a southern border state, so it has a warmer climate, more friendly to corn. So that's why there's more corn in there. So if you've got 65% rye, then you're going to have the rest corn and malted barley. So a good example of that kind of mash bill is going to be Old Forester rye, even though this is made in Kentucky. A little bit more about that later. The third mash bill is a Kentucky rye, as represented here by Elijah Craig, distilled also in Kentucky. And this is a 51% rye, 51 to 65% rye, with the rest being corn or malted barley. And Kentucky is famous for its corn and the making of bourbon. So the Kentucky rye is really so similar to bourbon that a lot of times it can be very difficult to catch the difference between the two. My cousin and I recently did some taste testing, and we had real difficulty discerning rye from bourbons if it's a Kentucky rye. I mean, it's too close. Now, there are some other styles of rye. You will hear mentioned Indiana rye. Indiana rye comes from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which is right across the river from Kentucky, so it's really the same region. And MGP is the largest supplier of rye whiskey in the country, and they are the source for many brands. Many brands have sourced their rye making to MGP, one of which would be George Dickel rye. George Dickel is a Tennessee whiskey company, but they source their rye from Indiana. Now, Indiana, MGP there has multiple mash bills, and you can pick and choose what you want. So some of the mash bills are going to be a Pennsylvania mash bill, some would be a Maryland mash bill, and some would be a Kentucky mash bill, because they have it all. So, what kind of distillery is that? Well, it's a huge distillery, and that's why a lot of people say, well, it's an Indiana rye. But usually, if they're saying Indiana rye, they're talking about a very high rye percentage in the mash bill. Even Sagamore Spirit, a distillery committed to bringing back Maryland rye in Baltimore, of all places, sources a lot of their whiskey from Indiana. Go figure. And again, I told you about George Dickel. Now, it's not labeled. If you look at the George Dickel rye, it's not labeled Tennessee whiskey. But they do say on the label that they put it through that Lincoln County process of chill filtering through charcoal. So they use Indiana rye. Now, Texas rye, as represented by Balcones here, this is another different type of rye. Now, this is 100% rye. Does that make it a Pennsylvania rye? I think not, although the mash bill would. But the thing about Texas rye is that all the grain comes from Texas, sometimes Oklahoma, and it's distilled in Texas, and the Texas climate greatly affects the making of whiskey. So they tend to have a unique flavor in Texas rye that is different from Indiana, different from Kentucky, different from Tennessee, different from Pennsylvania or Maryland. So that brings us to the point, terroir. Now that's a French term and originally was applied to the makings of wine. But terroir is the effect that the soil and climate and water of a particular region has on the distilled spirit. So rye whiskey is a perfect example of how terroir affects the end product that the consumer drinks. The different types of ryes all have unique flavor profiles that reflect their regions and climate and the differences in strains of rye grains. See, there's different types of rye grains, just like different types of wheat and barley, corn. And you've got different water sources. And so Kentucky is real proud of their water source that's limestone aquifer filtered. Well, Texas has similar things, and some distillers use rainwater. So the water makes a difference as well. And you can tell that if you travel around the country and you take a shower in one state and you come away with very soft water and it feels like you still have soap all over you. And then other states have a very hard water so that when you drink it, it's got a real heavy mineral presence to it. So the different styles of water in the different regions affect the whiskey. All right, so we've discussed a lot of the science, the law, the history. Let's now look at some of these different ryes and see if we can determine a flavor difference. We'll start with the Overholt, A.Overholt. And this is an 80% rye. In fact, here on the bottle, it tells you the recipe here somewhere. Bottled and distilled by James B. Beam Distilling Company in Claremont. And this is 80% rye and 20% soft malted barley. Aged for 4 years, non-chill filtered. And the proof on this is 95 proof. So this is A.Overholt. And let me cleanse my palate a little bit. I've been sipping on that Powers Irish rye. Okay, A.Overholt. Very rye forward. It's got a nice little burn to it. Get a little bit of the floral notes there, spicy notes from the rye. So, yeah, I can tell that that's a high rye content going on there. All right, let's go to Old Forester. And this has what's called the Maryland rye mash bill. So Old Forester, 65% rye, 20% malted barley, 15% corn. So it's got more barley than corn. This is distilled in Louisville. And this is 100 proof. Old Forester, I mean, for the price, I mean, this is about $25. And this is a high quality product. This is one of, I say it's my favorite about 90% of the time, but, there's a lot of good whiskey out there. They're all my favorites. immediately that comes across as softer and sweeter than the Overholt, but still floral. I still get the rye spice, mainly on the finish. So, this is still different from bourbon, very different from Old Forester bourbon, I'll tell you that. So this is just a wonderful, both of these were very good. All right, I'm going to have to rinse these glasses out. All right, next up, the Elijah Craig. This is a Kentucky rye. And so Elijah Craig's got a mash bill of 51% rye, 35% corn, 14% malted barley, coming in at 94 proof. Not real dark. And this would be one that I would really probably get confused with the bourbon. Yeah, that is a very bourbon-esque rye. You do get some of the rye on the finish, but otherwise that's a little bit sweeter than the Old Forester, I think. And, some other time I'll probably do some type of comparison between like Elijah Craig rye and Elijah Craig bourbon. But that would be real interesting to see if I could tell the difference. At 51% rye, that's, very similar. All right, so from there to Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels is a Tennessee rye. And so this is on a mash bill, 70% rye, 18% corn, 12% malted barley. So that's kind of a Maryland rye mash bill. However, this is distilled in Lynchburg, Tennessee, not Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So this is a Tennessee whiskey. It's gone through the Lincoln County process of charcoal filtering. I think they go through 10 feet of maple sugar maple charcoal that they burn on the spot at the site. 100 proof. So this is closest to the Old Forester. We'll see. Very distinctive taste. It's Jack Daniels. That Lincoln County process and just the way Jack Daniels makes their whiskey, you can tell this is related to Jack Daniels. And so if you don't like Jack Daniels, you probably won't like this. I happen to like Jack Daniels, and this is very similar to the regular Jack Daniels. That would be an interesting competition, is the rye versus the regular Jack Daniels. But it's the charcoal filtering really affects the flavor here. So it is sweet but spicy. I'm not so sure I'm getting the actual rye spice though. There's some baking spices going on there, but that Jack Daniels flavor and the charcoal filtering, that really does affect this. So if you're a fan of Jack Daniel, regular Jack Daniels, I would suggest that the Jack Daniel's rye would be a good step to get into rye whiskey. All right, Balcones is the Texas rye. And this is all grown in Texas. Well, I say it's all grown in Texas. There's a German rye element in here. This has Texas Elbon rye, German Cara rye, chocolate and roasted rye, pot still distilled, 100 proof, bottled and bond. So that German rye, I'm not sure if that's grown here or if it's imported from Germany. I kind of think that's imported, but I'm not 100% sure. But here, this is one of my absolute favorite ryes, favorite whiskeys ever. I'm a major Texas whiskey fan and Balcones fan because Texas climate does odd things to whiskey. You can see how dark that is. That's pretty dark. That's probably the darkest whiskey out here. 4 years in the Texas heat. And this is clearly distinct from all the others. This is the most different. When this rye came out, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, it was very controversial. People didn't know what to do with this. And I see why. I mean, this has I call it the Texas funk. Okay. It is rich in the Texas funk. And that is exactly what our climate does to whiskey here. So this doesn't taste like any of the other ryes. I kind of vaguely maybe get a rye flavor. But all I can say is this is just different. I'm trying to categorize this is incredibly difficult because it's unique flavor. And it's one of those whiskeys that you're either going to like or hate. I don't think there's any middle ground there. All right, there is now some international whiskeys that are rye. Canadian Club 100% rye from Alberta Distilling. Go Alberta. I'm a fan of Alberta. There's a independence movement going on in Alberta, and that attracts me. Okay, so this whiskey I've examined both in my Canadian whiskey studies and in my rye tournament, and it lost out to Jim Beam rye, and that surprised me because I really like Canadian Club, but I guess I really like Jim Beam too. Very good. Like I said, most whiskeys are my favorite. I don't know. So Canadian Club. So this is not an American rye. The rules for Canadian whiskeys are different. And frequently with Canadian whiskeys, if it says rye, it means different things than American rye does. This, however, is labeled 100% rye. And that it's just awesome. This is very good rye. So, yeah, Canadian Club. And then I've already had a Powers Irish rye, and I'm not a huge fan of this one. It's okay. It's decent. But there's just something kind of lacking there. I don't know. So the Powers is in this glass right here. And I brought this out because I'm also doing Irish whiskey this month. So that is pretty good. I mean, it's okay. You do get a lot of the rye flavor. It's 100% rye mash bill. I'm not a fan of Powers whiskeys in general. I've gone through their gold label and just won't go there again. This does taste a little bit like their gold label. So there's a relationship there, even though this is 100% rye. And this is actually better than the gold label for me, but it doesn't really compare with American rye whiskeys. But the fact is, there are international rye whiskeys. Johnny Walker has a rye. I've got a Danish rye whiskey that's 100% rye that is phenomenal. I mean, it is amazing. Okay, I didn't bring that one out tonight, but all right, this has just been a sampler to help us study rye whiskey on Friday the 13th. Coming up next, we'll continue our Irish whiskey studies. This is Stab the Dragon Productions, out here.